All right, so let's get started then with the last session of the day. And then we'll do just some really quick closing remarks there at the end. And so I will pass it over to Mike Cottmeyer.
Hey guys, how's everybody doing? It's kind of wild doing these virtual conferences. Great job pulling this all together to the committee and everything. So I was talking with Tim Wise in the background and debating as to whether to go through kind of my standard Agile transformation deck or to try to do something a little bit more adventurous. And since we're all from Atlanta, at least I guess we're all kind of from Atlanta, I thought we would, and we're amongst friends, I thought we would try something a little bit different. So what we're going to explore for the next 45 minutes or so is really what I would consider like my approach to Agile and Agile transformation, right? So we're going to do this virtual whiteboard style. Hope you guys don't mind the kind of the ad hoc nature of it, but there's some thinking that we've developed over the course of the last couple years that hasn't made it into the latest material. And so I thought it might be a little bit fun to try to explore this some, especially since this is kind of a quick talk. And like I said, we're amongst friends here. So I'm going to break my screen up into 3 pieces. And so what I want to start with a little bit is I want to make a distinction between 3 different systems that we see in effect when we're helping companies go through large Agile transformation kind of work. And just to give you guys a little context, like when I'm talking about transformation, I'm talking about like transformation of like Fortune 10, Fortune 100, thousands and tens of thousands of people going through large scale systematic change. Okay. And so, I'm not talking about like simple team level adoption here, right? Or teaching people how to do Scrum. So the 3 systems that I want to explore right out of the gate is what I would call a system of delivery, a system of transformation, and the third one, we're not 100% sure what we want to call it. Sometimes I want to call it sustainability, but for today, I'm going to call it a system of continuous improvement. And let me explain why I'm making the distinction between these three different systems. So when you think of a system of delivery, what I'm basically talking about is something that we would commonly understand as like an Agile methodology, something like Scrum, or maybe Scaled Agile Framework, maybe Large Scale Scrum, maybe something like Disciplined Agile Delivery, right? Lots of them out there, right? And they've been coming around for long periods of time, right? So a system of delivery is, in effect, a methodology that we would use to deliver in an Agile way. A system of transformation is what are the mechanisms that we are going to use to get the organization into the system of delivery that we so desire. And you say, well, Mike, that sounds pretty straightforward, right? We're just going to train people on how to use Scrum. Well, we're going to unpack that a little bit. So, Scrum was intended to be a methodology to support a small team operating in a very specific type of context. And so if we're going to teach people how to do Scrum, we have to actually make sure that those people are operating within that particular context as well. So a lot of times transformation is less about teaching people a new methodology and actually bringing the organization into alignment with the kind of an environment that methodology needs to be able to be successful. So, we're going to start to think about like things here like teaming strategies. We're going to start to think about things like governance. Now, those are all parts of the system of delivery, but we have to create the conditions within the organization so that those teaming strategies, governance, and things support the methodology that we want. And then last, and this is new, this is the part that I'm exploring with you guys a little bit, is the idea of a system of continuous improvement. So imagine that your organization has decided that it wants to go to SAFe, and it's put the work into creating the right ecosystem for SAFe to be a viable methodology for you. And then things change as business conditions change, as your product mix changes, as your market changes, right? So how do you make sure that as people come and go, as markets change and things like that, that the organizational ecosystem and the performance characteristics of the organization continue to advance in a way that we want them to? Okay, so this is things like, I'll just put up here like sustainability, okay, and ongoing change. Because as you guys might imagine, right, organizations aren't static and things change around them, so the organizations have to change in response. So for anybody who's been paying attention to any of my stuff for the last month or two, we've been doing a series of Wednesday afternoon webinars where I've been walking through like the physics of Agile transformation. So we've been going over things like capacity against demand and how to deal with risk and uncertainty, how to deal with trust and trustworthiness, how do we deal with things like encapsulation, orchestration. And so the one that I did yesterday, I guess it was actually Wednesday, was one on encapsulation versus orchestration. And I think that that's kind of an interesting precursor to this particular conversation, because so much of what we're doing in Agile requires a foundation of complete cross-functional teams. So if anybody's ever heard me do the talk where I go like teams, backlogs, working test the software. So let's look at like, what does it take to actually make Scrum as a delivery method work? We're going to talk about Scrum, we're going to talk about SAFe, we're going to talk about large scale Scrum. And so the first thing we're going to talk about Scrum, is we have a team of 6 to 8 people that are operating off of a standard backlog, right? A stack rank backlog. And then the team, through sprint planning, pulls work in. The team operates kind of like a black box and is responsible for producing some sort of working tested increment of software at the end of every sprint, right? So if we know the size of the backlog, we know the velocity of the team, we can start to anticipate things like scope and duration of whatever it is that we're trying to build. Okay, in order for a methodology like Scrum to work, one of the things that we fundamentally have to really pay attention to is the anatomy of a team. And so the anatomy of a Scrum team, again, right, this is all kind of basic stuff, but just bear with me here. The anatomy of a Scrum team goes something like this, right? So we talked about the 6 to 8 people. We talk about them being focused on a product or a feature set. They have a really clear backlog. They have autonomy over the technology that they're building against, right? And so the idea is that if I know what it is that I am building, and the team can self-organize to be able to build that product, and then we can measure on regular increments what it is that we're producing and make sure that it meets some sort of criteria, acceptance criteria, definition of done, we can start to bring this system into equilibrium, and it becomes kind of a trustworthy entity within the organization that allows us to actually start to make any commitments and to be predictable in market and all those kinds of things, right? The biggest thing that I want to like hit here is that what I'm in effect saying is that for a Scrum team to operate, that we have to reduce or eliminate dependencies, right? So one of my kind of big things I like to talk about a lot is the idea that dependencies get in the way of being Agile. So the point being is that if I want to do Scrum and I want to do Scrum effectively, I have to create the conditions for that Scrum team to be able to effectively operate. Now, one of the things I think is super fascinating, I'm going to go to a different page. I might toggle back and forth between some of these pages a little bit. Remember, I'm totally experimenting with you guys here, so we'll see how this story emerges over time. But one of the things that I think is super fascinating is that Scrum, like I said, basically assumes that all of the dependencies can be managed within the purview of the team. So like almost every single time I've ever seen a single Scrum team fail or struggle for any reason, it's almost always because the team needs somebody or something that is not part of that team. It could be as simple as like a QA resource. It could be, maybe it's organized as a front-end Scrum team, and there's some other Scrum team that has to create some sort of API in order for that team to be able to deliver. Maybe, there's some sort of cross-cutting concern or issue like that. But basically, anytime I see a Scrum team struggle, it's almost always because it has a dependency on something that is outside of what it can control. Because everything about Scrum basically requires that team have everything and everyone necessary to deliver what's in the backlog. So when that condition is not met, that Scrum team is going to struggle. Now, the way that I understand Scaled Agile framework, right, and this is probably an oversimplification, but is it basically SAFe came along and said, okay, well, at scale, we know that the world is more complicated than a single Scrum team. So SAFe basically came along and said, okay, we're going to acknowledge the fact that we have multiple Scrum teams out here in this ecosystem, and we're going to treat them all like a delivery unit. We're going to organize them around a value stream, and we're going to put a planning cadence around them, right? And so we're going to get together and we're going to do a big room planning meeting. We're going to do some sort of probably group review and retrospective, maybe on the front side of that planning meeting or on the back side of the PI. And then, each of these teams are going to sprint, right, as we go through here. And the idea is that during the PI planning meeting, we are going to understand all of the dependencies between these different teams, get them worked out, and get them resolved. And then we are going to, be able to deliver as a unit on a longer planning horizon. So probably rather than 2 or 4 weeks, we're probably looking at like 12, 20 weeks, something like that, right? But the idea basically is that within SAFe is that all of the dependencies can be encapsulated within this big planning unit.
So basically, the point that I was trying to make was that when you're talking about a system of delivery, the system of delivery is really about the methodology that you choose and having the conditions in the ecosystem such that you can actually do that methodology effectively. And so we have the idea of a system of delivery, we have the idea of a system of transformation, and we have the idea of a system of continuous improvement. Okay, so system of delivery, Scrum, SAFe, large scale Scrum, disciplined Agile delivery. Point being is that if you want to do any of those methodologies, you have to create the conditions for those methodologies to work. And furthermore, that almost always means in some form or fashion dealing with things like dependencies between teams, right? So what dependencies are always going to do for us is that they're going to create a situation where we typically are less agile than we want to be initially. So first distinction, system of delivery. Next distinction is system of transformation. And I'm going to see if I can try to explain this simply, since I'm just really drastically running out of time here. So let's imagine for a moment that we have a simple situation, right, that we want to transform. We have 2 teams. Those teams have dependencies between them, right? So what at a minimum is going to happen is that for both of those teams that want to do Scrum, okay, and they have dependencies, there's going to have to be something that coordinates across those 2 teams, okay? So the transformation process is not only about trying to figure out how to get each of those 2 teams doing Scrum effectively, but it's also figuring out how to manage those dependencies until we can break the dependencies. Okay, so the idea, so we've been talking about this idea of what we call our 4 quadrants, right? And there's a lot of organizations that are basically built differently, right? So we have the idea of a predictable organization or an adaptable organization, an organization that is built to emerge to customer needs, or an organization that is built to converge around very specific requirements. So what we find is that in a system of transformation, we are typically going from one quadrant to either a more agile quadrant or to a lean startup quadrant. So the idea behind a system of transformation is that if I know where I'm starting, right? Maybe I have agile teams, maybe I don't. Maybe I have dependencies between those agile teams, maybe I don't. Then what I've got to figure out is what can I do today within that ecosystem, given the presence of dependencies, given also the idea of malformed teams, and then how am I going to create a journey such that I can bring those teams into a more agile state now, and then in a very structured and disciplined way, figure out how to bring them into a more agile state as I start to deal with those dependencies. So in our world, we talk about this idea of base camp. So we'll take like a group of teams that maybe 6 or 7, 8, 9, 10 teams, and we'll move them into a predefined set of conditions. Again, in our world, we call them base camps. And so taking an organization from a very tightly coupled world where there's lots of dependencies into a very loosely coupled world where there's minimal dependencies is often a journey that takes a long time, right? So you go into a large organization that desires to want to try to implement a methodology like SAFe. We know that there are dependencies in between teams, and there's dependencies that are between different value streams in different parts of the organization. So what we generally find is that a strategy for transformation usually goes something like this. Do everything you can to stabilize delivery in the presence of dependencies using as much agile as you possibly can, right? So what this typically means is that an early stage transformation in the presence of dependencies, that you can form teams, but what you have to do is that you have to do more forward planning with those teams and more dependency management between those teams in the early stages. And so what the word that we like to use for that is this idea we call compensating controls, right? It's more than agile, right? Sometimes it's even more or heavier than SAFe. But what our goal is in an early stage transformation is to be able to do iterative and incremental delivery in the best possible formed agile teams we can, being incredibly explicit about dependencies and dependency management and cross-cutting concerns early, so that as we go down the transformation journey and we start progressively breaking dependencies, we can often deprecate those compensating controls. So for us, Base Camp 1 is stabilizing delivery in place, using agile teams and a lot of compensating controls to be able to deal with forward planning and cross-cutting concerns. And then figuring out how to take waste out of the system to be able to deliver and market faster, right? Smaller batch sizes, because one of the big things about Agile, right, is that we have to be able to get feedback from our clients faster. Then if we're going to go and we're going to keep going, the idea is that we want to get into a state called Base Camp 3, where we can start actually breaking dependencies between teams. Base Camp 4 is the idea of changing your funding model so that you are doing team-based or product-based funding. And then finally, Base Camp 5, which is about giving the teams freedom to be able to inspect and adapt and market. Okay. And so I'm going to just try to re-anchor here and settle myself and see if I can kind of get back into the story that we were trying to tell. So in the system of delivery, Okay. We basically decide which performance attributes of whatever methodology we want, right? So we might decide we want to move into a lean startup. We decide we might want to be more Scrum focused. We might decide that scaled agile framework is enough for us. And then, or we might decide something like large scale Scrum or disciplined agile delivery. What we're going to do in the early stages of our transformation is we are going to decide what are the attributes of the organization. How do we want to form teams? How do we want to deal with dependencies between teams? How do we want to deal with value stream groupings or capability modeling or building teams around business capabilities, things like that. And we're going to decide on our system of delivery. We're going to get really, really clear on what the organization needs to look like in order to be able to use that system of delivery. The actual work of the transformation is basically creating a change strategy, right? The system of transformation, so that I can create the conditions for that methodology to be successful. So if I'm going to go to Scrum, then I know I need complete cross-functional teams that own their technology, that have few, if any, dependencies between them. If I'm going to SAFe, then what I need to basically be able to do is I need to be able to create value streams that are loosely coupled from each other, okay? In the presence of dependencies in an early stage transformation, what I have to evaluate is, do I need compensating controls in these early stages to deal with the dependencies that the methodology doesn't basically give me a way of dealing with? So Scrum doesn't really deal with dependencies between teams. SAFe doesn't really deal with dependencies between value streams, okay? And so what do I need to do in terms of forward planning, dealing with dependency management, so that I can deliver in an agile way now, and then with the transformation journey itself being the progressive decoupling of those teams over time. One of the things that we've been experimenting with for the last couple of years that I think is a very powerful construct is something that we call outcomes-based planning. And what I mean by outcomes-based planning is, if I am going from base camp 0 in effect to base camp 1 to base camp 2 to base camp 3, and I know that my transformation journey is all about creating the conditions to be able to operate in the methodology that I choose, what you can start to articulate to the organization are, what are the intermediate outcomes that we need to produce in that organization such that the organization will perform in the way we want it to perform. So in an early stage, right, let's say I'm going to base camp 1, where I want to have stable teams, I want to have high degrees of dependency management. I want to start to get the organization to be able to deliver on a reliable and steady cadence. I know that at some point in that I have to have complete cross-functional teams formed. Then those teams have to be operating off of clear backlogs. Then they have to be able to do 5 to 6 sprints of forward planning. They have to be able to establish stable velocity. They have to be able to do a release plan, right? And so what we can start to do, because now when we're going through large-scale transformation in these organizations, basically being able to make and meet commitments and be able to go back to the business and to be able to explain to them what it is that we are attempting to accomplish and how the transformation is going to progress, so that we can create the right level of safety within the enterprise, is actually becomes a really big deal, right? So the organization is bought in to the system of delivery. We know that there's work to do in a system of transformation. So a big part of the system of transformation is things like, how do we break down the organization into, let's say, value streams? leading Agile, we call these expeditions, right? Groups of teams that are going to go through the journey together. What base camp are we going to try to get them to? What intermediate performance state are we looking for? What are the intermediate outcomes necessary to move us on that direction, right? And then what's kind of fascinating is that what we're fundamentally doing in the system of transformation is that we are running the transformation very much like a Scrum project or very much like an Agile project, where the actual backlog of the transformation isn't about teaching people how to do Agile or getting Scrum Masters in place or getting product owners in place. It's about actually taking a piece of the organization and moving it to a particular base camp, moving it through various outcomes, and then ultimately doing the coaching and training activities necessary so that these higher level outcomes and business goals can actually be achieved. Okay. And so one of the things we've been exploring quite a bit lately are what are the organizational cadences and such necessary to, in effect, run a transformation initiative, very much like what we would run a Scrum project. So we've been playing around with things like, creating, teams up here. We call them like an executive steering committee, create a team here, like a transformation leadership team. And these teams run on cadences, basically bringing work into the system, deploying coaching resources, deploying activities with the goal of getting the organization into a progressive level of maturity around the transformation itself. So again, I'm just going to keep reinforcing this. The system of delivery is basically about how we do the work. The system of transformation is about how we create the conditions to do the work, right? How do we get the teams formed? How do we do progressive breaking of dependencies? How do we measure the improved performance of the organization? How do we create safety for the enterprise at large so that it can continue funding the transformation and keeping the coaches on staff and things like that? And then the final piece that we've been exploring a little bit is something we call a system of continuous improvement. It's so, as you might imagine, like I don't know if anybody's been involved with an organization that has gone through a transformation backslid, maybe a new VP comes in and disrupts some things, or the organization reorgs or something like that. Well, so one of the things in large scale transformation that you have to pay attention to are creating things like an Agile transformation office, creating services within the enterprise to continuously monitor and develop the performance characteristics of the organization. And so some of the services that we've been playing with creating in some of these transformations are things like obvious things like a coaching service or a training service. But what about things like maybe an ongoing assessment service so that we understand how the performance characteristics of the team are evolving over time? Where this is getting really super fascinating is that, as you might imagine, an organization that is product aligned or business capability aligned, things like that, ultimately sometimes the customers and the markets of these companies change as well, right? So if we have an organization that's organized around business capabilities and those business capabilities change, or we have a group that is organized around value streams and those value streams change, right? How are we basically starting to, how do we evolve the organization over time, and how do we focus it at new things in a very structured and intentional way? Okay. And so what that starts to look like, right, is the way that we're starting to kind of model this is that when you start a transformation journey it actually starts with building the framework or building the infrastructure to do a system of transformation, right? So we need to figure out how to group the organization into expeditions, how to figure out what base camps we want them to go to, what the outcomes-based plans are going to look like, what are going to be their performance characteristics, right? What are we going to measure and what are we going to control, right? How are we going to know that the transformation is actually performing the way that we want it to perform? Are we going to create an ESC? Are we going to create transformation leadership teams? What is going to be the hierarchy? Basically, what is going to be the agile organization that's going to help us move the organization into greater agility? And then, so what starts to happen is we start to identify pilots that we want to have go through the system of delivery. And we start running those pilots through Basecamp 1, Basecamp 2, Basecamp 3, while we're doing things on the system of continuous improvement side, starting to build training services, starting to build coaching services, starting to build assessment services, okay? And so the point being here is that we want to focus on, we want to make sure that when we're orchestrating large scale change in this manner, it's not just about, are we teaching people how to do Scrum or how to do SAFe? We're actually building a capability organizationally to orchestrate and to manage the change. And then on the backside, in parallel, we are building things like agile transformation offices, coaching services, assessment services, things that are going to help us be able to, in effect, manage the ability of the organization to respond to changing needs over time and to make sure that the performance characteristics of the organization are preserved over time. Okay, and so I'm going to pause for a second. Are there any questions? I think we're technically out of time, but I know we have more. So
three things.
Yeah.
3 things for you. One, you sound great and everything looks great right now.
Okay, thanks.
2, we do have a question.
Okay, shoot.
It came up. But before that, I want to say 3. Take some extra time here. We understand that things
No, it's
get
cool.
shortened. So if you're willing to do it, we're willing.
Yeah, well, let's just answer some questions. So I don't think I built the story as well as I would have liked because of some of the disruption. So I'm just going to give it some space to answer some questions and see what people are responding to this.
All right. Here's the ones that we have coming in from Naveen.
Cool.
We have, how do you spread an agile mindset during transformation, and how do you measure it after 1 or 2 or 3 years to determine success or failure?
So one of the things I think about when I think about a mindset, right? And this is something that sometimes I'll do in some of my other talks, and I didn't tend to focus on it this time. But there's 3 aspects that I think work together to reinforce the agility mindset of an organization, right? And so what I will talk about is I'll talk about structure, practices, and culture. Okay. And a lot of times in Agile, we tend to think of culture and mindset as first order concerns. But one of the challenges that we have, right? And one of the challenges is that trying to get people to operate with a different mindset when they are in an operating model that is incongruent with that mindset. So just a really kind of simple thing is how do you get somebody to think more agile when they're operating in more of a waterfall command and control kind of world, right? And so my belief around having a mindset of agility is there's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem here that I'm going to acknowledge. But my belief is that you actually have to start with kind of the structure and the operating model of the organization. And then you have to enable that operating model with a set of practices that are congruent with the agility mindset that you want. And then you have to change people's behaviors and attitudes over time, right? And then they can start to think about continuously inspecting and adapting. So let me give you a for example, and then and hopefully this will answer the question and I'll move on. If I have people in functional silos, right? So I have devs, QAs, business analysts, project managers, right? And I'm building matrix teams across those functional silos, and people, human beings on those teams are being assigned to multiple projects, right? So I have a QA tester that's here, and a QA tester that's here, and a QA tester that's here. And I tell them, I want you to operate with more team focus, more agility, right? All that kind of stuff, right? I can put the burden on that individual to operate in a way that is incongruent with the operating model that they're in. Or I can do something radical and I can say, okay, we're going to put those people in a cross-functional team, right? We're going to put them on a single team, and we're going to teach them the mechanisms of Scrum, and we're going to hold them accountable for operating off of a backlog and producing a working tested increment. And then we're going to coach things like mindset within that container, right? You can evaluate the mindset of those people operating within those containers based upon the way that they respond to the inputs and the way that they do their outputs. Okay, so to me, the container you put them in, the structure of the organization, the practices, the operating model stuff, and the mindset all have to be congruent and all have to work together. One of the mistakes that I think that we make in our industry is that we recognize that if people had an agile mindset, getting them into the right structures and the right practices would at least theoretically be easier. But in practice, the mindset changes don't necessarily lead to the structural and practices changes that we necessarily want at scale in large organizations. So again, right, I'm really focused on large organizations, large organizational transformations. As leaders, right, going in and working with executives and senior management, the senior management's highest lever is to put people into teams with minimal dependencies, operating off of clean backlogs, able to produce a working tested increment at the end of the sprint, and then coach things like responsibility, growth mindset, flexibility, adaptability, right? Because now we've created an ecosystem where that kind of mindset gets rewarded. In the previous ecosystem, that mindset doesn't necessarily get rewarded. Or if it does get rewarded, it doesn't necessarily manifest in the business benefits that we want out of it, right? So I don't know if that answered the question. It's hard when I'm like staring at myself in a computer screen and not getting any like visual feedback here, but any more questions?
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, we've got 3 more questions queued up. So the next one is, what authorities and decision-making capabilities does the Agile Transformation Office have?
What kind of authority in decision-making? Well, you know, what I would like them to be able to do is to basically define, you know, so basically they have the responsibility for going through and in effect assessing the organization and building consensus around how that organization is going to group agile teams, how they're going to orchestrate the transformation, what rules they're going to play by. Oftentimes we'll have them actually like build a playbook that talks about like expedition readiness, how to assess what base camp they're going to go to, how to build outcomes-based plans. Typically, an Agile Transformation Office has the responsibility to work with the organizations that are going through transformation to make sure that they have sufficient funding, that they have a coaching strategy in place, they understand what they're going to measure and control, they understand what success looks like, and so they become, you know, in effect, the governing body of the transformation itself. And so they get to basically say, it's ready to transform, it's transforming, it has been transformed, we got the business benefit out of it that we want. One of the largest transformations that we're going through, they have an executive steering committee that basically like the CIO and all of the main senior leaders are in, and they meet like every week for 3 hours, hundreds of concurrent expeditions going on in parallel, basically assessing the progress of the organization and basically how they're allocating funding across that enterprise to be able to make sure that those transformations are going the way that they expect. One of the big things that when you start getting into mega-sized transformations is that it becomes incredibly important for the organization to understand like what its OKRs are, what the KPIs are. I hate to use such corporate language, but that's the language of large companies, right? And so what they have to understand is that if they're going to go down this transformation path, there is a very specific measurable business benefit that they want out of it. It's not just Agile for the sake of Agile. So the transformation office is spinning up the expeditions, helping them figure out what base camps they move to, what the performance characteristics of the future organization are going to look like. Is the transformation making the right measurable progress? And can they measure that progress in an unambiguous way on the backside to make sure that they're getting that return on investment that they signed up for? So the transformation office in general, the Agile transformation, office or steering committee or whatever in specific, right, has the purview of moving the organization through those different conditions.
Awesome, thank you. So we've got 4 more questions.
Let's keep going.
So can we get Mike to talk a bit more of the system of transformation and circle of setting up the Agile consulting offices? The other circle, I think you had on one of your last diagrams, the far right circle.
Yeah, that's the continuous improvement one.
Yeah, how will that work and how does that tie into the base camps that we're come up with?
How does it work and how does it tie into the base camps? Not 100% sure I know exactly what you're getting at with the question. The mental model, like when we come in and so like we're in the early stages of a transformation, a lot of times it kind of happens. It's a little bit like iterative and incremental. Like if you think of the, see if I can draw the circles here, right? So you think of the system of transformation, right? The Agile transformation office here. Then you think of like a system of delivery, right? Scrum, SAFe, right? And then you think of the system of continuous improvement, different services, different assessment vehicles, different, sometimes we'll call them improver teams, things like that. What a lot will happen, if you think of those as like increments in a piece of software, right? So this is an increment, this is an increment, this is an increment, this is an increment, this is an increment. What you might build is you might build like an executive steering committee and a transformation leadership team. And then it starts off over here with a pilot. And then over here, you start working on a playbook and you start working on kind of your assessment model, right? How are we going to measure performance? Okay. So you have an initial hypothesis on your executive steering committee. You form your first transformation leadership team. You start exploring over here with a pilot. As the pilot begins to emerge, you start developing your playbook. You start assessing how that organization is performing and moving along. Assuming the pilot has success, maybe you spin up, maybe you spin up a pilot number 2, or maybe you start doing a more general rollout. By that point in time, you have your playbook hardened, you have your assessment framework hardened, you're spinning up more TLTs. Then over here, you say, okay, well, we're going to instantiate this assessment service, or we're going to build a capability to provide internal coaching, right? And so what starts to happen is like a transformation is emergent, like a product is emergent, but it has to be done within a structured framework. So think about like one of the things in software product development that we're doing with Agile is that we are trading off the illusion of certainty for a very structured cadence of making and meeting commitments. So that's like a really big like underlying principle of Agile. It's like, we're not going to make big annual commitments, but what we're going to do is we're going to be really rock solid at delivering every 2 weeks so that we can expect and adapt our way into the product that we want. And so we're trading certainty for incredible transparency, visibility, and short-term making and meeting commitments. Very similar with the transformation office metaphor. We're going to build just enough of the system of transformation to get the initial pilots rolling. And then as we get the initial pilots rolling, you start to enumerate the playbook and you start to run assessments and you start to build internal coaching capabilities. And then as you have success, right, it begets success, right? So we have more pilots starting to run, right? Then we build out more aspects of the system of continuous improvement. And then the system of transformation becomes entrenched and instantiated with more TLTs and things like that to be able to orchestrate the transformation. So it's almost like, it's almost like you're building an Agile organization to help the organization transition to Agile. I don't know if that makes any sense, or again, it's hard for me to tell if I actually answered the question or not, but I'll just leave it at that, and then anybody can follow up with me if they want to have a further conversation about it. So what would be the next one?
Are you open to one final question?
Yeah, let's do it, yeah.
Awesome. All right, so let me grab one of these. So you mentioned before when you got hiccups in the Agile transformation that interrupt the process, what does that triage look like to reset and or get the org back on track?
Hiccups in the Agile, repeat the question for me one more time, I'm sorry.
It says you mentioned the hiccups in an Agile transformation that interrupts the process.
Okay.
What does that triage look like?
So one of the metaphors that we use, right? One of the metaphors that we use, and this has been kind of a fascinating evolution in some of these super large transformations, is that we use business capability modeling to create an initial hypothesis for how the organization is going to structure teams. And so what happens, like what a business capability is it's basically like something that the business uses in order to be able to deliver services. It could be a set of services, it could be a set of features, it could be a product, it could be some other sort of capability. And so our initial organizing metaphor within an organization is, let's identify what the business capabilities are. Let's identify the dependencies between the different business capabilities. And then let's start hunting value streams across the business capabilities, right? So a team isn't usually initially pointed at a business capability, right? So you'll have your team execution here, right? And then there will be some sort of like value stream that rides over top of those different capabilities at the program layer, typically subordinated to like a portfolio layer, right? Where investment decisions are being made. What can start to happen, right? So let's say we go through and we say, we identify that this is our system of delivery, right? And so we execute our system of transformation to build it. But then let's say this team stops being able to make and meet commitments. Okay, so its throughput gets bad. Or let's say the market no longer requires that business capability and it needs a different business capability. And so one of the things that we've been playing with, right, as we go into these large organizations and we have long-standing transformations with them over time, what we're starting to find is that the initial transformation hypothesis, while valid, it risks becoming as rigid as any other particular hierarchy, right? Because once you've moved to it, right, the tendency is to want to stay in it. Okay, so two things can happen. The teams themselves can stop underperforming. Let's say we mess with their mix of people, or maybe the technology gets a dependency in it that we didn't anticipate, or technical debt, like all kinds of different things. Or the actual organization's mission and purpose changes. What we've got to do is we've got to figure out a way to be able to reevaluate the organizational structure and the systems and practices and governance and things like that we've wrapped around it, right? So that the organization itself can change, right? So the metaphor that I've almost been using is like almost like white blood cells in a body, right? There's got to be a capability within the organization to continuously monitor the health of the system and to start to anticipate when it breaks, and then to start to recognize organizational change that needs to be ongoing. So it almost becomes like, and again, right, I don't have this fully like set in my head, but it's like once we have the system of delivery in place, it was installed by the system of transformation. In parallel, we built the system of continuous improvement. I think what we're going to find is that over time, the system of transformation and the system of continuous improvement collapse on each other at some point, and it becomes like a I don't know if you guys, as a business owner, you hear this a lot, right? So I'm working in the system versus on the system, right? And so the system of delivery becomes a set of things that are in the work of the organization. And then there's a set of things that become, how does the organization change and reinvent itself over time? So that's what we're starting to tease out, right? And so, if you guys have been following my stuff for a long time, right? The build of leading Agile over the last 10 years has been very emergent in ourselves, right? Things start to reveal themselves to us as we go deeper into this. One of the early models that I ever put together was this thing we called the 10 circles, right? And so we talked about structure, governance, and metrics. And then there was like this thing we had around like train teams, coach teams, install practices, things like that. And then there were a set of circles around here that were around like monitoring and assessment and things like that. And we were using this to try to explain to people what the process that we were going through is. And so what's kind of cool is that we really started working on this like about 10 years ago. And what's starting to happen is that we're starting to realize is that we in effect we ended up basically articulating early stages of system of delivery, system of transformation, system of continuous improvement. Because you have to understand what's the system you're trying to build. You have to start to articulate how is it that you're going to build it. And then the third part being is how do you make sure that it doesn't calcify in place, and what mechanisms and structures are you going to put in organizationally so that the organization itself can continuously improve. Okay. So again, right. So I appreciate you guys kind of humoring me on this as I explored. I actually had some good lessons learned, technology differences and challenges aside. But this is where I think it's going to go, right? Right now, we are focused as an industry on system of delivery. We've been beating this drum around system of transformation for a long time, because what we're finding is that, especially in large scale organizations that are going and spending, sometimes tens of millions of dollars on transformation, like having the ability to structure a transformation and be able to demonstrate incremental and iterative progress is as important in the transformation as it is on the product side. And just like you don't want a product to calcify and to get stagnant, right? The organization needs mechanisms itself to make sure that it's not getting calcified and stagnant either. Because what tends to happen is that we say, okay, system of delivery installed, we're done. Then the organization changes and we don't, or the market changes, and we don't have ways of adapting the organization to the new needs of the market. Okay. So that's kind of what I'm getting at by the system of continuous improvement.
Awesome.
What else we got?
That is a wrap.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think
you guys are welcome.
Great.
Thanks for having me, and good job pulling this together. This is pretty awesome. I'm glad you guys were able to make it work.
All right. So we are closing it down, you guys. Again, thanks to everybody who stuck around for all the sessions. We hope that they were informative and that you learned something. We will also be sending out a survey in a little while just to get your feedback on it. But, obviously a big thank you to all the speakers that we had today, all of the sponsors for this event and the in-person event, and the attendees. But also wanted to do a special shout out here at the end to our graphic recorders. And so that is Kimberly and Renata, and you guys can see their information here on the screen. But what they draw when they're listening and watching these events is just amazing. So this is just what they did last year at the event in 2019. They've been doing them throughout the day today as well. And so those will be accessible online along with all the recordings from today and any of the slides that some of the speakers used. Those will all be available within the next few weeks on our website, Agile Day Atlanta. We'll send out an email to everybody that came with a link to that content. And then if you enjoyed today and want more, if you haven't already purchased a ticket to our in-person event in August, it's August 14th. And we have 12 speakers, 10 different sessions across subjects, business and leadership agility, fundamentals and experience reports, and we've got a great keynote by Doc Norton also. So we're super excited about that event. And again, obviously, we don't know what the next few months are going to hold for us in terms of the virus. And so if it's not safe for us to put on an in-person event in August, we won't. This was a good experiment for us, as Tim mentioned in the beginning, to see if we could pull off a full day event online. And so, we will do that if necessary to keep everyone safe. And that is a wrap, you guys. So again, thanks also behind the scenes. Chad has been the host that's running all the slides and the music. I will also say that the Spotify list for the music today that some of you guys seem to really love, we'll link to that as well on our website. We made it now a public Spotify playlist. So hopefully you guys can enjoy that as well. But that is it for this time, and we will see you again in August. Bye, everybody.